Hi, I'm Stacy Garrity, your state treasurer. It's an honor and a privilege to be part of the 26th annual Joint Observance of Black History Month organized by the Pennsylvania Treasury Department and the Pennsylvania Department of the Auditor General. Thank you for joining us at today's celebration as we recognize the importance of the countless contributions made by Black Americans to Pennsylvania and the United States of America. As a nation, we've officially celebrated Black History Month since 1976, when President Gerald Ford made the first official proclamation. In part, he said the celebration was a time to honor the too often neglected accomplishments of Black Americans in every area of endeavor throughout our history. The month-long celebration has been a catalyst to help educate Americans about critical moments in our nation's history and the important contributions to our history made by Black Americans. This has been done through school programs, community initiatives, and presentations like today's, where we'll soon hear from our local historian, Calobe Jackson, Jr., whose breadth of knowledge surely can't be matched. And I want to thank Auditor General DeFoor for inviting Mr. Jackson to be part of today's event. And I'm very much looking forward to the discussion. So much has happened since 1976 and that first celebration of Black History Month. And many of those moments are now captured in the pages of our history books. New chapters begin every day, and every story can inspire progress as we learn not just from the factual details of an event, but how to use that knowledge to move toward a better future for our state and our country. What makes America great is our collective dedication to freedom and equality, two principles that remain at the forefront of our conversations today. We must strive to understand, appreciate, and learn from our history in order for our democracy to continue to thrive in the decades and centuries ahead. Almost 30 years ago, poet and civil rights activist Maya Angelou addressed the nation with her powerful voice when she said, "History, despite its wrenching pain, cannot be unlived, but if faced with courage, need not to be lived again." These words exemplify the need to consider what has happened before to create a better after, a better future for ourselves, our children, and every generation that comes after us. We are all part of what our founders called a more perfect union, and we are given the promise of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. While perfection itself is an ideal that we can only strive for, I believe it's important to focus on the notion of more perfect, and that focus should inspire all of us to be more understanding, more accepting, and more welcoming to people and ideas that we can all learn and grow from. The more we learn from history, the better our future will be. And now it's my pleasure to introduce my good friend, Auditor General Tim DeFoor.
Thank you, Treasurer Stacy Garrity, for those kind words. And I'm glad that our departments can join together for this important annual event. Black history is Pennsylvania history. So many African Americans and Black Pennsylvanians have contributed to the advancing of racial equality. Some of the well-known names include Bayard Rustin, a leader in movements for social, civil, nonviolence, and gay rights. Richard Allen, founder of the African American Episcopal Church. C. Dolores Tucker, civil rights activist. And William Howard Day, abolitionist, editor, minister, and the first Black employee of the Department of the Auditor General. But there are many less famous people who have worked for years, quietly, and without much fanfare. People who make overcoming the struggle part of their daily life. They work at it every day of their lives with almost everyone they meet. For them, it has become second nature. I recently sat down with one of those memorable people, Mr. Calobe Jackson, Jr. A Harrisburg resident, Mr. Jackson is widely respected for his knowledge of local history and Black history. First of all, Mr. Jackson, I want to thank you for being here today. It is without a doubt an honor, a privilege, and a pleasure to have you speak to us today. So thank you. So why do you feel that it's important to talk about Black history in Pennsylvania?
Well, Pennsylvania was one of the leading states of our nation, as we know, and Pennsylvania has all the history. And the Black history of Pennsylvania is part of that. So it's very important that we know about the history and we pass it on to other generations so that they can reflect on what their ancestors accomplished.
So you grew up in Harrisburg. You grew up in
Yes.
Harrisburg in the 30s and the 40s. How do you feel that life today for Pennsylvanians, Black Pennsylvanians, is different today than it was back in a time where you grew up?
Well, first of all, I grew up, as you say, the 30s, which was the Great Depression, and the 40s, which was basically World War II. So in the 1930s, I saw how African Americans in Harrisburg, with very little money, were able to live pretty comfortable lives as far as having relationships with churches, libraries, YMCAs, sporting events. Although we didn't have much money, but we were not poor, as you might say. We were rich in culture. And of course, then World War II came along and changed everything for a lot of us. I saw the young men march off to war. I did not go, I was Army in the Korean War, but I saw all the men go off to World War II. And then when they came back, I saw how much it changed them, what they saw the world. And he came back and they were ready to change Harrisburg because they knew what was going on in the world.
Now, how did your time in the military, how did that change you and your perspective on life in general?
Well, I was drafted in 1951 in the Korean War. And I was one of the last all-Black battalions because Truman had given an order to desegregate the services in 1948, but it took years for it to happen. So being in an all-Black outfit training at Fort Belvoir, we were planning to go overseas. We thought we'd go to Korea and see action or something. But Truman, being president, said, no, I'm not sending any more all-Black units to Korea. We're going to desegregate in the Army. So I just sat with a unit at Fort Belvoir for 2 years. I did have the opportunity to go to school. I was very good in mathematics, so they sent me to school as to be a surveyor. And I learned the surveying trade there. And I did meet people from all over the world, which gave me an idea of what was going on throughout the world. And after the war, then I started working at the post office. But my experience in the military was very enlightening.
So you have your experience in the military. You have your experience in the postal office.
Postal, yes.
Did that then lead you to become involved with the community?
Yes, because the post office is very involved in the community. We know just about everything that's going on in the city. You'd be surprised. We know who gets the mail and who doesn't get the mail. When zip codes first came out, AMP got so much mail they basically had their own zip code. And we knew what was going on in the state. We knew that one department got a lot, property and supplies got more mail than anybody. All got mail, so we had to separate mail for the state. So we recognized names. Well, M. Harvey Taylor was a famous name, the governors. So working in the post office broadened my activities. And I became a member of the YWCA, and I joined the Historical Society. And I became very interested in Harrisburg history. Because growing up through those years, and my father had a barber shop, I met a lot of the African Americans that had prominent jobs in the capital, who from Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, K. Leroy Irvis, some of the others, Dave Richardson. They came. You always see them in the barber shop, and like you mentioned earlier, you see people in out in the social life. You get a different perspective of their activities.
Yeah, and one of those is without a doubt the barbershop. I
yes,
remember back when I had hair. I remember going to every other weekend. I remember going to Wallace's barbershop.
Yes.
And that's where you would meet everybody in the African American community.
Yes.
They would talk about any and everything. So
Yes.
so to me, that was a part of my education.
Yes.
Part of my informal education. But you also were a Harrisburg school board member.
Yes.
What was that experience like compared to what is happening across the country today?
Around 1990, I had a son was in the middle school, and I went to 2 school board meetings. And if you show up after you go to 2 school board meetings to express your opinion on something, someone's going to ask you, do you want to run for school board? And I hadn't thought about it. I was asked to run for school board. I said, well, why not? And the first time I ran, I lost terribly because my name wasn't out there.
Right.
And everybody the political parties had picked who they were going to vote for ahead of time. But the second time I ran, I won in a landslide. So that was a very interesting experience because I learned so much about the function of the school board. When you're not on the board, you don't realize all the things that are going to happen in the city, how much support you're going to get from the state, what support you're going to get from the community, why you have to have taxes, why you have to have discipline in the schools. And this is an enlightening experience.
Yeah,
I enjoyed it.
And without a doubt, because that's when I had first heard your name, back when you were with the Harrisburg School Board. So here we are, and right now we're kind of living in some somewhat turbulent times. Why do you feel that it's important for everybody to understand not only history, but in particular Black history? Because to me, Black history is a part of history, but there seems to be at times some type of controversy with regards to how it's being taught. What are your thoughts on that?
You're correct about that. Some people, now we know there's a lot of violence in Black history, and some people just want to talk about that. They don't want to talk about, we know that we had hard times, we know the horrors of slavery, and all this, but they don't want to talk about some of the other things. One of my favorite books is Du Bois' book about the heritage of Blacks. And he talks about the Black musicians, the Black mathematicians, the educators, not the violence part, but the educators and what Blacks have accomplished. I think the book was called The Accomplishments of Black Men. And it's an exciting book. And we should explain both. So we don't want to forget the horror parts of Black history, but we need to tell everybody about all these outstanding men like yourself.
I appreciate that.
Are part of our history. And if we do that, then we'll have our youngsters will follow the footsteps that our forefathers provided for them.
Yeah, so I appreciate your comment because I'm going to go back a few years. I was in college and I was doing a paper on the preservation of the Harrisburg train station, and that kind of spawned my love into history. So I remember walking into the Dauphin County Historical Society, and there's only one person that was at a table, had some papers around them, they're doing some type of research. That person was you. Okay. You didn't know who I was,
right?
But I knew who you were.
Yes.
And I wanted to talk to you about history, but I was too nervous. So I simply said hello, okay. and I kept moving. So what would be your advice for someone like that young kid that I was back then, who really wants to understand Black history in Pennsylvania? And they would come to you and say, Mr. Jackson, what advice do you have to offer me? I really want to learn.
Well, you're correct. The main thing that we have all this technology, we have the Google, we have email and so forth, but it's nice to go into a historical society and just sit down and talk to the people in there. And once you start to realize what do they have on their history. For instance, at the Dauphin County Historical Society, we have all the yearbooks, back to John Harris, William Penn, Central, Tech, all back into the 1890s. We have city directories back in the days. So if somebody comes and starts talking, and once you get a conversation going, you say, well, where's your family from? So someone will say, well, my family's from Georgia. And I might say, well, what year did they come to Harrisburg? And they say, well, in the 1920s. I said, okay, what was the name? Give me a name. I'll pull the city directory, and I'll just start, say, 1925, and pull the city directory to see if that family's listed.
Wow.
And if it's listed, if it's not, I'll go back and forth. And then once you show somebody, they see their family name in a city directory, they become excited. And they start looking at other things. That's how you can do a yearly search. Then you search the census. This coming April, the 1950 census will open up, April the 1st. And more people will be able to see themselves in the 1950 census. You'll see your name and where you lived and who was in the house and who your neighbors were. And this is very interesting.
That is, and also it gives you, when I was exploring my own family history, on both sides, my mother's side of the family and my father's side of the family, going back throughout the years, for me, it gave me a sense of pride. A sense of pride that I really couldn't get anywhere else but knowing where I came from. And so that that kind of history, you can't put a price on it.
Right.
And another thing that me and you had worked on were the help with the preservation of some of the black cemeteries where soldiers from I think the Revolutionary War, Civil War, without a doubt, World War I and World War II, where they're buried at. And some of the conditions of these cemeteries aren't exactly the best. Going forward, as far as saving that particular part of history, what is it that we as a community, me as an elected official, can do to help get the word out, saying that these cemeteries need help?
Well, basically, they need money, basically, and people that are dedicated people to help. Now, the Lincoln Cemetery, for instance, the church can no longer keep the cemetery up on their own funds. They just don't have the funds in the church. So they have to reach out for volunteers to come in. Cutting the grass is a big feature of keeping the cemetery up. During the season, the grass must be cut at least once a month. The preservation of graves, keeping the stones readable, and they just need money. And so we have to divert some type of money from other sources into keeping our cemeteries up.
Okay, well, thank you for that. I see you brought a book with you today, 100 Voices. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yes, I brought this along. This is the book 100 Voices. Now, as you know, on Walnut Street, we put 4 statues up at 4th and Walnut at the entrance to the Tanner's Alley would cross with Walnut Street. And working with Linwood Sloan and other groups, we put 4 statues up. William Howard Day, Thomas Morris Chester, Jacob Compton, and 1 female, Fanny Few, which he went by the name F-E-W, which is Fanny Ellen Watkins Harper. And all of these people had some impact in Harrisburg. The 3 of them, the 3 men, all lived in Harrisburg for many years, off and on. The woman, Frances Harper, she visited Harrisburg, giving speeches on temperance and suffrage. And all of them, the statue was located in parts of the old 8th Ward. So when the statue was put up, we started looking at names. We had several ideas. One was to put bricks down with people's names on. And Linwood came up with the idea of putting a pedestal up, and we put 100 names around this pedestal of people, African Americans, and not all African Americans, but people that provided some input into the activities of the 8th Ward. So I picked 100. I had the privilege of picking the 100 names. We had Messiah students do research on these people, and then we put them into this book and published the book.
Wow, and as some people may not know, the old 8th Ward is where the Capitol complex currently is, and where my building, the finance building, is. So I would urge anybody out there to learn about the 8th Ward, and also to pick up your book.
Yes, well, it was around 1910 when the Capitol realized they needed more space.
Yep.
It's always two stories. There's one story that they tore the old 8th Ward down because it was unbecoming to the Harrisburg. It was a source of violence in the 8th Ward. But that's not the total story. The state capitol needed more buildings. And to prevent some of these from being built in Pittsburgh or Philadelphia, they said, well, why not enhance the Capitol building by putting buildings behind the Capitol? Have a Soldiers Grove, and you have your Revenue building and your the Forum building. So that's what happened. It actually tore the houses down between 1914 and 1919, and of course in the 1920s all these big buildings went up.
Oh, amazing. Mr. Jackson,
Yeah.
I can't thank you enough for being here today. So again, thank you for coming. It's without a doubt a pleasure.
It's my pleasure, General.
We'll talk to you soon.
Yes.
Thank you. My sincere thanks to Calobe Jackson Jr. for sharing his important perspective for Black History Month. We have made a lot of progress, but there's still work to be done. We must dedicating ourselves to create a better Pennsylvania, where every voice is heard and every child has a chance to succeed. Our society and our communities become stronger when all people have the opportunity to participate and contribute. My thanks to Stacey Garrity for co-hosting this event. Thank you for joining us. Be safe.